She's been gone for 3 days, and you still haven't left her side. It's roughly 100,000 years ago, in a cave that will one day be called Kafsa, in what's now northern Israel. The body beside you is small, a child, maybe 13 years old. You've dug into the earth floor of the cave with your hands and whatever tools you have, deep enough that the ground itself becomes a kind of container. Before you cover her, someone places a pair of deer antlers against her chest, deliberately, carefully, the way you'd arrange something you needed to get exactly right. Nobody told you to do this. There's no religious authority standing over your shoulder, no ritual manual passed down in writing. And yet something in you insists this matters, that this body cannot simply be left where it fell, that this moment demands a gesture, a marker, something. 92,000 years later, give or take, archaeologists will find that grave and immediately recognize what you were doing. Because the impulse hasn't changed. Not really. So here's the question worth sitting with for the next 12 minutes or so. What did ancient humans actually do when someone died? And why does the answer matter so much for understanding what makes us human in the first place? This isn't just an archaeology trivia question. Death, and specifically how a species responds to death, might be one of the sharpest windows we have into the emergence of human consciousness itself, into empathy, into abstract thought, into the terrifying, clarifying realization that the people we love are temporary. Because here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. Most animals do not do what you did in that cave. They don't bury. They don't decorate. They don't return to a body repeatedly over days. Something happened in human evolutionary history that turned death from a purely biological event into a psychological, social, and eventually spiritual one. Figuring out when that shift happened and what triggered it tells us something profound about the architecture of the human mind, and honestly, about why you still feel that lump in your throat at funerals for people you barely knew. Let's start with the evidence itself, because this is one of those rare areas in paleoanthropology where the physical proof is almost unbearably intimate. The site at Kafsa Cave, along with a cluster of related sites across the Levant, contains some of the oldest confirmed deliberate burials in the human record, dating back roughly 90,000 to 100,000 years. These aren't bodies that fell into a hole and got covered by sediment over millennia. Researchers like Ofer Bar Yosef and colleagues who studied these sites point to clear indicators of intentional burial. Bodies placed in specific flexed positions, pits dug deliberately into the cave floor, and in several cases, grave goods included alongside the remains. At Kafsa specifically, one skeleton was found with the antlers of a deer positioned against the chest, an arrangement that shows every sign of deliberate placement rather than accidental proximity. Think about what deliberate burial actually requires, cognitively speaking. It's not a small ask. You have to recognize that a body, once animated and personal, is now permanently different, not sleeping, not temporarily incapacitated, but changed in some fundamental and irreversible way. Then you have to decide that this changed thing deserves specific treatment. Then you have to expend real physical effort digging into ground, often with nothing but bone or stone tools, at a moment when your entire group's energy would normally be devoted to hunting, gathering, and immediate survival. Burial isn't efficient. From a purely survival calculus standpoint, it's actually a strange use of resources, which is exactly why it's so revealing. This connects to a psychological concept that shows up constantly in modern grief research: the human need for closure through ritual action. Studies on bereavement, including work by grief researcher George Bonanno, consistently show that humans who engage in some form of ritualized processing after a loss, even something as simple as a specific routine or ceremony, tend to show different long-term emotional adjustment patterns than those who don't. The act of doing something with the body, something deliberate and structured, appears to help the living mind process an event that is otherwise almost incomprehensible: the sudden, total absence of someone who was just there. Early humans burying their dead may have been doing, instinctively, exactly what grief counselors now recommend deliberately. Not because they read a psychology journal, because the underlying human need, turning chaos into structure, absence into ritual, appears to run extremely deep in our species' wiring. Now let's push further back in time, to evidence that's genuinely strange and still hotly debated: homonality. In the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, researchers led by Lee Berger discovered the remains of Homo naledi, a small-brained hominid species with a skull roughly a third the size of modern humans, dated to somewhere around 250,000 to 300,000 years ago. The remains were found deep within an extremely difficult-to-access chamber, reachable only through narrow, twisting passages that would have required deliberate, sustained effort to navigate. Not somewhere bodies could plausibly wash in by accident or fall into by chance. Berger and his team have argued this represents intentional deposition of the dead, possibly even the earliest known form of mortuary behavior in the hominid lineage, predating anatomically modern humans by a significant margin. If that interpretation holds, it suggests something genuinely disorienting to the traditional narrative, that treating death with intentional, ritualized behavior might not require the large brain we've always assumed was necessary. It might be older and more widespread across the hominid family tree than we've been comfortable admitting. This is exactly the kind of finding that should make you suspicious of tidy narratives about human uniqueness. We like origin stories. Humans developed a big brain. And then, and only then, did we get religion, symbolism, and death rituals as a kind of cognitive bonus feature. Homo naledi complicates that story considerably. Maybe the emotional and behavioral response to death didn't wait for modern human intelligence to show up. Maybe it's older, messier, and less exclusively ours than the popular narrative suggests. There's a third thread worth pulling here, and it moves from burial specifically into something broader: care for the dying, which might actually be even more revealing than care for the dead. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal remains dating back roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years show clear evidence of severe injury and disability that predated death by months or even years. One individual, commonly referred to as Shanidar I, had a withered arm, significant hearing loss, and healed but severe skeletal trauma, injuries that would have made him functionally unable to hunt, gather effectively, or fully contribute to group survival for an extended period before he eventually died. And yet he survived for years after sustaining these injuries. That survival is not biologically explicable without sustained help from other members of his group. Someone brought him food he couldn't gather himself. Someone protected him during periods of vulnerability. This wasn't a one-time act of compassion. It was ongoing, effortful, costly care extended toward an individual who, in pure evolutionary terms, offered diminishing returns to the group's survival. Some archaeologists, including Eric Trinkaus, who extensively studied the Shanidar remains, have pointed to this as strong evidence of genuine social compassion among Neanderthals, not just among modern humans. This matters enormously for how we understand death behavior, because caring for the dying and ritualizing death after the fact are really two expressions of the same underlying psychological trait: the capacity to value another individual's existence beyond their immediate usefulness. That's not a small thing. It's arguably the emotional foundation underneath everything from modern healthcare systems to hospice care to the entirely irrational, economically inefficient amount of money families will spend trying to extend the life of someone who has little chance of recovery. We still do this. We still bankrupt ourselves for people who can no longer contribute anything measurable, because the value we assign to another human being was never really about their output in the first place. Let's add one more layer, because there's something specifically about symbolic behavior around death that deserves attention. Ochre, again, showing up at burial sites with startling consistency. At numerous sites across Africa and Eurasia, red ochre pigment appears scattered on or around burials, sometimes covering the body directly. Researchers have proposed multiple explanations: practical uses like hide preservation, or purely symbolic ones tied to blood, life, or some early conceptual link between color and vitality. Whatever the precise motivation, the consistency of this pattern across widely separated sites and time periods suggests something beyond coincidence. Humans, repeatedly and independently, seem to have reached for color as part of how they process death. This tracks with something you can observe today without much effort. Funerals still involve deliberate color choices: black in many Western traditions, white in parts of East Asia, vibrant colors in some African and South Asian traditions, celebrating a life rather than mourning its absence. The specific colors shift by culture. The underlying instinct, That color carries emotional and symbolic weight during death rituals, appears remarkably persistent across tens of thousands of years and wildly different societies that had zero contact with each other. Now, the necessary complication, because the story isn't a clean, linear march from no-death rituals to full religious ceremony. The honest truth is that we don't actually know what most early death behavior meant emotionally or symbolically to the people practicing it. We can observe that a body was buried deliberately. We cannot directly observe whether that burial was motivated by grief, by fear of the body attracting predators or disease, by social status displays, or by some early proto-religious belief about an afterlife. Archaeologists are working from bones, pigment residue, and grave goods, never from the actual internal experience of the people involved. Every interpretation carries some degree of projection, and honest researchers acknowledge this constantly. There's also significant debate about how widespread these practices actually were. Deliberate burial sites represent an infinitesimally small fraction of the total number of humans who died during these periods. Most bodies, across most of human prehistory, were almost certainly left exposed, scavenged, or disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace whatsoever. The burials we find and study so intensely might represent unusual, special cases, specific individuals treated differently for reasons we can't always determine, rather than universal standard practice. It's entirely possible that formalized death rituals were rare, inconsistent, and highly dependent on specific circumstances for the vast majority of human prehistory, rather than a consistent cultural feature present in every group everywhere. This matters because certainty is tempting and rarely earned in this field. The most responsible position is one of informed uncertainty. Humans clearly developed some capacity for ritualized, intentional responses to death remarkably early, but the exact timeline, motivation, and consistency of that behavior remains genuinely contested and probably always will. So let's return to that cave near Kafsa, hands still dirty from digging, deer antlers resting against a child's chest. What that moment represents isn't really about religion or the specific belief systems that would eventually follow. It's about something more foundational, the recognition that another individual's existence mattered enough to demand a response beyond simple biological disposal. That's the psychological thread connecting a 100,000-year-old burial to a modern funeral, to the enormous, often irrational amounts of care humans extend toward the dying, to the specific outfit you might choose to wear to a memorial service without fully understanding why the choice feels important. Death forces a confrontation most other survival pressures don't. It's not solvable the way cold or hunger or predators are solvable. You cannot outsmart it, outrun it, or build a tool sophisticated enough to prevent it indefinitely. What you can do, what humans, apparently, have been doing for well over 100,000 years, is refuse to let it happen in silence. Refuse to let the person simply disappear without acknowledgement. That refusal, small and strange and cognitively expensive as it is, might be one of the oldest and most defining threads running through the entire human story. Next time you find yourself at a funeral, or lighting a candle for someone, or simply pausing at news of a death, notice the impulse underneath the action. That impulse is ancient. It didn't start with any particular religion or culture. It started somewhere in a cave, with someone who had no words for what they were feeling, but knew, with total certainty, that leaving the body untouched simply wasn't an option. If tracing these strange, quiet threads through human history is something you find yourself thinking about long after the video ends, stick around. There's a lot more buried in the past worth digging up.